We are now going to enter the New Kingdom, and I've got 2 lectures for the New Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, we're going to look at 2 categories, although I've mixed them up a little bit. We look at temples for gods, which are temples at Karnak and Luxor for the gods Amun, Mut, and Khons. And then we have 2 temples for rulers, the Temple of Hatshepsut and Ramses II. But I want to go chronologically because I think that makes a little more sense. So Hatshepsut and Ramses II both have rock-cut tombs, but Ramses is much later. So we're going to start with Hatshepsut in the Amarna period, and then we'll look at Tutankhamun's tomb, which many of you probably have heard of. And then the last lecture will be the temples at Karnak and Luxor. So here's our famous map again. So now we are going to look at Deir al-Bahri, which is where Hatshepsut's temple is. And then Karnak and Thebes and Abu Simbel. Karnak and Thebes are going to be on the next lecture. That's where the temples to the gods Amun, Mut, and Khons are. Abu Simbel is where Ramses II's rock-cut tomb is. It's across the river from the Valley of the Kings. And then we'll look at Tel El Armana, which is a unique thing unto itself. So I've given you a link to an ancient Egypt timeline here, so you get the idea. So here's a little bit of history. The 18th dynasty is the beginning of the New Kingdom with Thutmose III. So here's our word Pharaoh. Our very first Pharaoh is Thutmose III, and he calls himself a Pharaoh, which means great house. And these pharaohs were builders. And builders, again, are dear to my heart. Kings that are builders, emperors that are builders, are building society. They're building artwork. They're building architecture. And so these guys, they built temple complexes, palaces, forts, cities, sculpture, tombs, you name it. Now remember, at the end of the Middle Kingdom, we had that turbulent time where the Hyksos invaded. And so in 1550, Ahmose threw them out, and he became the pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. But it isn't until Thutmose that the actual word is used. So Thutmose III extended Egypt all the way to modern Syria, and they began marrying Near Eastern king families. So that's really crucial too. And so here's a link to Thutmose III. This is the official beginning of the New Kingdom. So in the Middle Kingdom, one thing that's happening is there's a priestly class developing at Thebes in Upper Egypt, sort of separate from the kingdoms itself. And they become very powerful because the king is no longer in charge of the Nile rising and falling, but we still have the Egyptian religion in place. So people are still going, making offerings, supporting them. The capital and the wealth of the New Kingdom resides primarily in the south at Thebes, because this is where the priests are. And so because of this, we have a split in power, because the priests at Thebes have adopted a god Amun, who is the god of the air, and he's also a hidden god. And so Amun becomes the god of the great temple complexes at Karnak and at Luxor. And so Amun is sharing the lands of Egypt with the king. So this, in another way, is kind of why I've divided these lectures up the way I have, because we'll look at Hatshepsut first, who builds her rock-cut tomb, and she's a pharaoh. And then we're going to look at King Aten of Amarna, who is just an anomaly, if you will. And then just a little bit about Tutankhamen, just because it's a tomb and the coffin that just tells us so much about them. And then we can look at these temples that tells us about their religion. So we have cultural expansion, colossal temples, beautiful tombs. And so we do still have decorated tombs, but the temples are the main focus. And temples are made of stone. So, for example, Hatshepsut's rock-cut temple is also her tomb. Egypt becomes a dominant world power. They're conquering their neighbors, and women are gaining power. There's fertility cults, and so wives and mothers and daughters of kings gain some religious power. Now, we've already seen that they can gain power of the state, for example, with Pepi II, but now they get religious power too. These are the items that we'll look at through the New Kingdom in the next 2 lectures. So here is Queen Hatshepsut. Actually, she's not a queen. She's a king. I shouldn't say queen. Here is King Hatshepsut. She's one example of a woman with power, and she ruled from 1473 to 1458, so a pretty good long time. Her husband was Thutmose II, and Thutmose III was her husband's son, not her son, but her husband's son, and he was too young to rule. So Hatshepsut ruled until Thutmose III came into power. She was very efficient. She made many trade alliances. She was one big way that she expanded Egypt was through trade, and she contributed to the country's wealth. They had peace, they had prosperity. So this is a sort of a younger version of her. This is from Dihir al-Bahri, where her rock-cut temple is. This is Hatshepsut's rock-cut temple. So she was really one of only 4 queens that ruled Egypt. The other 3 are Cleopatra, Sobekneferu, and Tusret. We don't really learn about them in this class, but they're interesting nevertheless. So Hatshepsut had herself declared king. She wasn't a queen. She was a king, and she had herself portrayed in all the ways a male ruler would be portrayed. She had the false beard. She had the scepter. She was even portrayed as a human-headed sphinx. And so this temple, if you cast your minds back to those Near Eastern ziggurats, this temple would have had trees and running water and beautiful plants and flowers. It would have been very lush. And it extends, if you see way back in the back, behind all these colonnades, it goes deep into the mountainside. Now, this complex actually has several temples in it. Hatshepsut's is way over to the right. It's the biggest one. You also can see Mentuhotep for 1 and 3 from the 11th dynasty. On the very left is Mentuhotep II, and then in the middle, Mentuhotep III. So she isn't the first one to build in this site. This complex is dedicated to Amun and several other deities. In the New Kingdom, the kings, and after Thutmose III, the pharaohs, claimed the god Amun as their father. So they combined his identity with Ra. So they didn't say that they were the god. They said that they were the son of the god. Amun is the supreme deity, and so the Amun rules the gods, and the pharaoh rules the humans, but they rule together. So it's a divine right of kings. If you notice, all 3 of these temples have processional entrances. Again, this is much like the temple complex at Giza, the pyramid complex at Giza, where there's a place for the funerary procession, and the processions of worshiping can go up these ramps, and everybody can see. Here's a diagram of this complex just to sort of unpack this for you. So if you look to the left, you can sort of see an above ground cutaway view, and you can see the part that extends inside the mountain. So make no mistake, this is not called a tomb. It's called a temple, even though there's a tomb in it. And the orientation is toward the great temple of Amun at Karnak, which we'll see in the next lecture. The most important function is to worship the king's patron deity during his or her lifetime. So while Hatshepsut was alive, or Mentuhotep was alive, or whoever else had a rock-cut temple, the people would come and worship their Ka statue, but they would worship the god Amun. And then after they died, they actually worship the king himself as a god, because the king becomes a god and stands with his or her father in eternity. Her original intention was she wanted to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, but she ended up being buried here. So if you look at this plan, again, it's as though we chopped the roof off of it. You can see the causeway. So again, it heads toward the Nile. The Nile, you could imagine, over to the left side of this slide, then the Valley of the Kings on the other side of the Nile. So this, you can see Mentuhotep III's temple and Hatshepsut's temple next to it. If you think back to that picture and those 2 causeways sticking up, you can see marked where these 2 colonnades are, the sets of ramps, the 3rd court, and then all these chapel shrines to the various gods, to Cathor, to Anubis, or to whichever, immediate god that they're praying to. This is what it would be like if you're standing right next to the colonnade. Very, very simple columns with square bases and square capitals. And of course, there's ruins of many, many other columns here, other ruins. I said that Hatshepsut was a very shrewd businesswoman. This particular carving is from the Temple of Hatshepsut, and it's illustrating her trade with the Queen of the Punt. So it was located to the southeast of Egypt, of where they lived. So they go up the Nile down to the south, and they would get incense, they get exotic spices there. And so this image shows the queen of the punch. She was a very obese woman. But there's an interesting thing about this trade. The whole text shows that Hatshepsut's treasurer went to Punt to collect payable tribute, right? But in all reality, this was a commercial expedition. So they would bring cheap stuff like beads, weapons, just cheap glass, things that didn't cost them anything to make. And then they would exchange these cheap beads and weapons for very valuable items: incense, ebony, gold, ivory, furs. They would have an escort of 5 ships with soldiers. This is all depicted on this illustration. So not only was it definitely a one-sided trade, it was enforced. You can definitely see parallels in other areas of history there. Here's Hatshepsut as the Sphinx, again represented as a male king. She's wearing the headdress of Horus and the false beard of the pharaoh. Just some other figures of her. Again, a powerful ruler like her would have many, many Ka statues. I find this granite face on the right particularly arresting, as she's looking out through these eyes, and she has this calm expression, this calm confidence of success that we haven't seen in the Middle Kingdom at all. We haven't really seen this since Khafra. In 1352, we have this king named Amenhotep IV, and he marched to a different drummer. You can see what you think about this. He did all kinds of things. He founded a completely new religion. He threw out the religion that the Egyptians had had for 2,500 years. He changed his name to One Who is Effective on Behalf of Akhenaten, and his new religion was all about divine truth. And so he makes artwork that supposedly portrays his royal family as realistic, as quote-unquote truthful. Very informal portraits. It's a complete departure from anything we've seen. Here he is. He wasn't a very efficient ruler, I will say. He was weak, both physically and mentally. He was not a warrior king. You can see from this picture, his face is weak. And a lot of people, some scholars think he had an endocrine disorder. He had these sort of secondary sex characteristics that developed. Nobody really knows. But he definitely did not fit the mold of any that came before him. He felt very threatened by the power of the priests at Thebes. So he was weak, but he was also kind of cagey, if you will. The priests at Thebes were becoming very powerful. So he changed the religion of Egypt from one of many gods to one god, and he moved the capital from Thebes to Akhenaten. So effectively robbed the priests of their source of income, because now the religious capital is at Tel El Amarna, so the tribute of the people and the religious rites are coming there and not up to Karnak. He cut off all the revenue to the temples. Imagine the effect this had. Here he is. This is a relief of Akhenaten and his family having dinner. You can see the Aten, the sun disk, up here above them. This is on another stele. And so he insisted that the sun disk, which he called Aten, himself, who was Akhenaten, and then his wife, Nefertiti, that they would be worshipped as a triad by the people of Egypt. I've mentioned the Theban triad, you'll see in the next lecture, Amun, Mut, and Khans. Well, Akhenaten says, no, we're the gods, we're the sun disk, and I and my wife. So this is set out among the people to soak up the rays of the sun, and it's set out as a message to remind people. There were many, many of these, and he put them around so that people would be reminded who he was and what they're supposed to worship. The inscription reads, "Kiss and embrace under the beneficent rays of the Aten, whose love pervades all of creation." The technique is called sunken relief. So instead of sticking out, there's undercutting, and then the limestone is carved away again so that the relief in effect is all at the same level of the stone itself. He challenged the entrenched religious cults. He threatened the very existence of the established priesthood, and nobody knows where he got these ideas. He completely broke with artistic convention. And so when you look at these Amarna portraits, you can clearly see that it's him. The lips are fleshier, the earlobes are longer, they're longer faces. Here he's holding this crook and flail. You can see the elongated torso. You can see the long neck. You can see this big lips, these long ears. But he's giving himself all of the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. Here's two different portraits so you can really get a good flavor for this Amarna style. Egg-shaped skulls, very precise lines, beautifully carved. Here's one of his daughters, again, the same characteristics, and his wife. Now, this statue is an anomaly because it's not really in the Amarna style. It's not really in any style that looks like any other sculpture we have from ancient Egypt. And that may be because there's other sculpture we've never found or because this sculptor was unique. No one really knows why, but we know a lot about Nefertiti. She was very powerful in her own right. She had her own fertility cult. She was a very important part of Akhenaten's new religion. She may even have invented it for all we know. She's got beautiful regular features, a very long neck, very heavy lidded eyes. They look almost too perfect to be real. She's beautiful, right? Absolute perfection. This sculptor understood the human form. He had a complete command of geometry, and it's not finished. Now, you notice the sculptor's name is Thutmose, not to be confused with Thutmose III, the king. It was a common name. But this sculpture stands on its own in Egyptian art. Just two other views of the same head. We don't know, the assumption is that it would have been meant for a tomb, but we don't know for sure. Here is Akhenaten's mother, Ti, and she was the main wife of Akhenaten's father, and she had a huge influence on him. Maybe she helped him with some of his ideas. Anyway, she was identified with Isis and Nephthys, but she turned her portrait into the royal portrait when her son came to power. Okay, now what happened to Akhenaten? Well, the people in the court really enjoyed being part of the court, but for most people, they did not, because they didn't get any of the benefits of Akhenaten's court. They lost their religion. They lost all these rituals and their markets that they would go to so many times a year, the places where they would go and trade, the centers of their religious life. For over 2,000 years, they'd performed the same religious rites, so they were scared. They were sure the gods would have retribution on them, and what happened? By the time Akhenaten had ruled for 17 years, there was a plague, and Akhenaten died in the plague, so now he's gone. So the people said, okay, this is the revenge of the gods, and they got rid of Akhenaten's religion, and they went back to the Egyptian religion, and they brought the capital back to Thebes. So only 3 girls out of their 7 children lived, and there were 2 very weak boys in line for the kingship. Some people think that Nefertiti was Akhenaten's daughter. People aren't sure. But anyway, King Tut ascended the throne at age 8, and he married Akhenaten's youngest daughter. And we have his tombs. So again, his new ideas died with him. King Tutankhamen changed his name to Tutankhamun for Amun, the god, moved his court back to Thebes, and we have his tomb, which is one of the only tombs that has been discovered intact. But before I show you that, I just want to show you this Book of the Dead. Now again, you notice the date, this is 1285, so it's late, much later New Kingdom, but I want you to understand it here because we're going to look at the artwork that came from inside this tomb. And this is really a system that, again, has been in place for 2,000 years. So this is just meant to help you understand the way they would use these books. If you study this scroll, and if you go online, you can get books about this whole Book of the Dead. Like it's a manual, really. It's a study guide. When you die and you go to the underworld, you actually have to pass a test in hope that you obtain everlasting life. You have to learn all these different ways that you're supposed to act and things you're supposed to do. And if you don't pass the test, you might not get everlasting life, or you might just have to haunt your tomb forever or whatever. So the family of the dead person is going to commission the scroll while the body's being prepared for entombment, and then this scroll would go with them. This particular picture is the judgment of Hunefer before Osiris, and your book has a really good explanation about how they preserve the dead and the information about this particular image and what a lot of the figures mean. Basically, the figure in white is Hunefer. So these are different scenes of Hunefer, who's the overseer of the royal palace of Seti I. So he was wealthy enough he could buy a Book of the Dead, and he's educated enough that he could read it. So obviously, if you're going to have a Book of the Dead, you've got to be able to read the Book of the Dead. So it sort of goes to say that you're going to be in a certain place of society to have this book. So here is the inner coffin from Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. It's solid gold. It's inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones because gold is symbolic of the indestructible flesh of the gods. So you can see now why so many of these tombs were looted and probably the gold melted down. Very few of these intact tombs are found. So King Tut reopened the temples at Thebes, he reinstated the religion, and his tomb was intact when it was discovered. He had 3 coffins or sarcophagi inside each other like nesting dolls in a box. The biggest one is still in the Valley of the Kings. You've got to go there to see it. The other ones are in museums, and this one is the middle one. It's made out of wood covered with gold. So that solid gold coffin that I showed you a minute ago would be inside this one. So the inner coffin is solid gold, weighs 250 pounds. And then the second coffin is gilded wood and it's got glass paste on it. This is a picture of a throne from inside his tomb. And so it's interesting because here is this sun god that we saw in the god of Aten, although King Tut was back to Amun and Khans, but some of the imagery remains the same. And here's his face looking out at us from his middle coffin. And here's the death mask from the innermost coffin. And this wouldn't be complete without the actual archaeologist. So this is a photograph of Harold Carter, who discovered this grave, opening up Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. Just imagine being him. So after Tut died, General A assumed the throne. He had abolished the sun disk. He tore down all of the temples created by Akhenaten. So King Tut reestablished the religion of Amun and Khans, but then A took away the sun disk, and you saw that we still had the sun disk with Tutankhamun in that throne. So the next ruler, Horemheb, began the construction of the Temple of Amun at Karnak in Egypt, and temples like this one are going to become the primary form of architecture commissioned during the New Kingdom.